Hey guys, tonight we're settling into a story that only finished last Christmas Eve. A woman named Annette died quietly in Quebec at 91, and a small museum on a northern lake made the announcement for her. She was the last of 5 identical sisters, the most photographed children of their century. With her went the final living witness to the strangest childhood any government ever built. Tonight is the whole of it, start to finish. 5 baby girls, born to a farm family in Ontario in 1934, taken from their parents by an act of law, raised behind a fence, and shown to nearly 3 million visitors, while the world called it protection. This is the story of the Dionne Quintuplets, and of the 91 years it took to end. So settle in and turn the lamp low. We begin before dawn, on the 28th of May 1934, at a farmhouse near Corbeil, Ontario. Nobody there was expecting history. Only a young mother in trouble, and a long dark wait for the doctor. If these quiet histories help anyone rest, the subscribe button is the gentlest thanks. Leave a comment with the city and the hour, because I like knowing where the lamps are still on. Our 3 little books live at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, the QR code on screen goes straight there. On a phone, the links wait in the description and the pinned comment. And whoever drifts off in the middle, good, that is the point. I will keep watch. The house was small and wooden, and it had no electricity, no gas, and no running water. Elzire Dionne was 24 years old that night. She had already given her husband Oliver 5 children in the 9 years since their wedding. Her 6th confinement had come 2 months early, in the hours when farm country is at its stillest, and it was quickly clear that this night was different. The lamp burned, water heated on the wood stove. One after another, faster than anyone could take in, 5 daughters arrived into a kitchen built for a family's ordinary mornings. 5, each one tinier than a farm cat, each one alive. 2 neighbour women got there first. Elzire's Aunt Donalda and a Madame Lebel, midwives of the practical country kind, delivered the first 2 babies by lamplight before the doctor arrived. His name was Alan Roy Defoe, a widowed country physician from the village down the road, and he delivered the remaining 3. The record keeps the parents' own words from that morning, and they are worth hearing plainly. Oliver, the father, said, 5. What am I going to do with 5 babies? Elzire, from the bed, said only, Holy Mary. Nobody in that kitchen wept for joy. Nobody there believed the babies would live past breakfast. They had come 2 months too soon, into a township with no hospital for miles. The nearest sure thing was the heat of the stove. Here is what 5 of them amounted to on a kitchen scale. 13 pounds and 6 ounces, all together. The biggest weighed 3 pounds 4 ounces, the smallest 2 pounds 4. A grown hand could cover any one of them like a blanket. There was no incubator within 100 miles, so the women did what farm kitchens have always done with fragile new life. They lined a wicker basket, set it by the open door of the stove, and tucked the 5 in together, the way a person banks coals for the night. Stove heat, a borrowed basket, and hot water bottles. That was the entire hospital. Everyone who came through the door that morning said some version of the same thing, and said it gently. These children were not going to live. Feeding them was watchmaker's work. Their mouths were too small to nurse, so the women sweetened warm water with a few drops of corn syrup and gave it from an eyedropper, 1 bead at a time, around the clock. 2 hours on, and the next feeding already coming due. Whoever held the dropper counted the drops. Whoever tended the stove kept the fire exactly where it needed to be, hour after hour, because the basket by the oven door was doing the work of a hospital ward. It went on like that through the first day, and the first night, and the day after. The 5 smallest hearts in the country, kept beating by corn syrup, stove heat, and the stubbornness of tired women. Help came up the road the next day in the shape of a very young nurse. Her name was Yvonne Leroux, just out of the hospital training school in North Bay, and she arrived at the farmhouse carrying a hot water bottle, which tells you most of what medicine had to offer that kitchen in 1934. She did not turn around. She stayed. She warmed 5 babies, fed 5 babies, turned 5 babies, hour upon hour, in a house where the light came from a lamp and the heat came from a firebox. And when she needed to chart their progress, there was no chart to be had, no forms, no folder. So the first medical records of the most famous birth of the 20th century were kept in pencil on the backs of old bills. Weights in one margin, feedings on the reverse of a feed store account, temperatures wherever there was room. Think of how that would sound in a modern hospital, and then think of how it sounded there, where it was simply the best that could be done well. One tired young woman, writing carefully on scrap paper by lamplight, was for a little while the entire staff of the entire hospital of the 5 most watched patients in Canada. The country did not know their names yet. She was already memorizing which cry belonged to which basket corner. Keep her in the frame as everything grows glassier and grander around this family, because the story starts the way it means to indict what follows. Before there was an apparatus, there was a person. Before there were shifts and staff lists, one young woman did all of it, for love and wages smaller than the postage the baby's fan mail would soon require. Then the wider world began to help, and for a little while the helping was pure. In Toronto, in Montreal, and as far away as Chicago, nursing mothers read about the 5 in the papers and did the one thing distance allowed. They expressed their own milk, bottled it, packed it, and put it on northbound trains. Crates of it came up the line to the little station and then out to the farmhouse. Milk from hundreds of strangers, handed across the kitchen door like the neighborly gift it was. The incubators came next, water-heated ones, one shipped from Chicago, another sent up from Toronto. Warm water jackets instead of stove heat, and the wicker basket by the oven door was finally allowed to retire. Day by day the 5 stopped losing ground. Then, very slowly, they began to gain it. An ounce here, an ounce there. Ounces were the whole economy of that summer. And somewhere in those first weeks, without ceremony, a line was crossed that no family anywhere had ever crossed. All 5 were still alive. No quintuplets in recorded memory had survived infancy together. Not in Canada, not anywhere. The little house near Corbeil now held the first, and the world was starting to understand exactly what it was looking at. No committee organized that, no act of any legislature required it. It was simply what ordinary mothers did when the radio told them 5 small strangers were hungry, and it worked. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet before everything changes, to see the scene whole. A wooden farmhouse in the northern bush, in the worst year of the Depression. Inside it, a mother recovering by lamplight, a father doing sums that will not come out right, 5 older children being hushed on the stairs, and 5 new daughters asleep in borrowed warmth. Around them nothing but dark spruce and gravel road. Every ounce of milk in that house had been a gift. Every piece of equipment had come off a train. The family had nothing to spare and had been given everything necessary, and for 1 week, that was the entire story. Strangers had fed 5 babies they would never meet. It is the kindest week in the whole 91 years, and it deserves to be remembered that way, because kindness is about to acquire a box office. Hold the week gently. It will not come again. For 7 days, the story of the Dionne family was a story about kindness with no return address. A miracle is a private thing for about a week. After that, it has visitors. The reporters found the farmhouse first, and then the photographers, and the road that had carried one country doctor now carried carloads of strangers with notebooks. And before the babies were 4 days old, ahead of them all, there came a man with a briefcase and a contract. The province would count the carloads soon enough. The family only counted the dust they raised, settling on a porch rail that had never needed wiping twice a day before. His name was Ivan Spear, and he had come on behalf of the World's Fair in Chicago, the Century of Progress, where an exhibit of the quintuplets was already being imagined for the paying public. Set his offer against the arithmetic of that kitchen. The farm was small. The children now numbered 10. The equipment keeping the newest 5 alive was borrowed, donated, or improvised. and the man of the house had spent 3 days watching his family's future arrive and threatened to leave again, 5 times over. Into that kitchen came terms that were plain and enormous at once. $100 down, in hand, that day. $250 a week to follow. A dairy farmer in the northern bush might not clear that in months, and here it was offered weekly, for nothing more, the man said, than letting the world admire what had already happened. Oliver Dionne signed. It is the signature the rest of his life would be read through, and it lasted about as long as a spring frost. Within days he thought better of it, took advice, and moved to pull his name back off the paper. But a signature is like a shot. The sound carries whether or not the hunter regrets it. Picture the scene the offer made, because the offer was itself a picture, a glass pavilion on the fairgrounds by the lake in Chicago, and inside it, 5 Canadian farm babies on display beside the marvels of industry. That was the plan being sold, and in the language of the fair, it was called progress. The word the northern townships used, when the papers explained it, was shorter and older than that. But the money was real, and the debts were real, and nobody who has never chosen between shame and groceries should be quick to grade the man's first answer. The fair itself never got them. That much the record settles quickly. What the fair proved, in 3 days flat, was the price the world had already put on a look at these children, and prices, once spoken, have a way of staying spoken. The contract died quickly. Elzire had never signed it. Her signature was legally required, and so the paper was void almost as soon as it was famous. But void is not the same as harmless. The story of a father renting his dying newborns to a sideshow crossed the continent in about a day, and the headlines were merciless in the way only distant headlines can be. None of the people writing them had stood in that kitchen counting drops of corn syrup. None of them owed 10 children breakfast. The outrage was real all the same, and outrage travels well. It traveled south into the American papers, and it traveled down the highway to Toronto, where it landed on the desks of men who now saw, in one exhausted farmer's worst decision, both a scandal and an opening. Oliver had already repudiated the deal. It made no difference at all. The country had decided what kind of father he was, quickly and comfortably and at a great distance, and governments listen very closely when a country decides a thing like that. The village priest and the family's own neighbors would spend years arguing the man was better than his headline. The headline never ran a correction. It is an old, reliable machine, distant judgment. It runs best on partial facts and empty stomachs it has never felt. And once it has produced its verdict, the verdict outlives every correction, every context, every kinder second look. Oliver Dionne would carry his for 45 years, to the end of his life, and in a way, this whole story is the bill for that one signature, presented to the wrong people. And in Toronto, the file stayed open. To understand what happens next, hold the year in mind the way the people living it did. 1934 sat at the bottom of the Depression. Prices for everything a farm could sell had collapsed. Men rode freight cars looking for work that did not exist, and families measured their weeks in flour and kerosene. Into that grey world arrived one piece of unqualified good news: 5 identical baby girls who refused to die, and the hunger for that news was bottomless. Papers that could not sell hope sold the quintuplets instead. That hunger is not an excuse for what was built on it, but it is the true climate in which every decision in this story was made, by the parents, by the doctor, and by the government, and it never once let up. Remember the freight cars and the flour when the crowds arrive, because the crowds will be made of exactly these people, scraping together gasoline money in the worst year of their lives, to go stand in the northern bush and look at hope through a wire screen. Nothing about what follows makes sense without that ache. Keep one more thing from this cold ledger. In a decade when nothing grew, one thing in Ontario was about to grow without limit, and it slept in 5 cribs behind a fence. The first taking was gentle, and the parents agreed to it, which is exactly what makes it hard to hold. In late July, with the babies 8 weeks old and still fragile as paper, Oliver and Elzira signed a custody agreement with the Red Cross. 2 years, the paper said. The society would carry every medical cost, the nurses, the equipment, the specialists, all of it, and in exchange, it would hold guardianship of the 5 while they grew strong enough for ordinary life. For a family that had been improvising a hospital out of a kitchen, it must be said plainly, this was salvation with a signature line. And by September there stood, directly across the road from the farmhouse, a brand new nursery built for the purpose. Electricity in every room, running water, plumbing, steady heat that did not depend on anyone feeding a firebox at 3 in the morning. On the day the 5 were carried across that road, it looked like rescue, and in fair measure, it was rescue. The babies were warm, the bills were paid, the parents had given up 2 years, on paper, and could visit their daughters 100 steps from their own porch. Hold on to that number. The road was about 100 steps wide, and the girls would not truly come back across it for 9 years. What the society brought was not small. Trained nurses on rotation, specialist consultations, equipment renewed as fast as 5 growing patients could outgrow it, and every invoice settled without the family seeing it. Measured purely in medicine, the babies had been moved from the poorest care in Ontario to some of the finest on the continent, and the move can be counted in ounces gained and fevers survived. Measured in anything else, the counting is harder, and the rest of tonight is that count. The 2 years mattered to everyone who signed. The 9 that actually passed belonged to nobody's signature at all. The second taking wore a crown. In March of 1935, the legislature of Ontario, under Premier Mitchell Hepburn, passed a law written for exactly 5 people on Earth. It was called the Dionne Quintuplets Guardianship Act, and what it did can be said in one breath. It made Yvonne, Annette, Cecile, Emilie, and Marie wards of the Crown, not wards of their mother, who had carried all 5 of them at once and lived. Not wards of their father, who was raising their 5 older brothers and sisters 100 steps away. Wards of the King, formally, personally, by name. The arrangement was presented as temporary, a protection for childhood's fragile years, and it would hold, in practice, until the girls turned 18. Sit with the plain shape of it for a moment, calmly, because the rest of this story grows from here. A farm family brought 5 daughters into the world in a lamp-lit kitchen in May. By the following March, the law of the land said those daughters belonged, in the deepest legal sense, to everyone. And a thing that belongs to everyone can, with the best intentions in the world, be shown to everyone. There is a detail in the wording that catches most people who read it now. The law did not speak of the quintuplets as a class or a category. It named them, each one, 5 first names of 5 living babies, written into a statute of the province. A birth certificate says a person has arrived. This paper said, in the politest legal language, who that person would now answer to. No other children in the country's history had their childhood assigned by name in an act of a legislature. These 5 did, before they could sit up. Here the record asks for honesty in both directions, so let's give it both. Slowly. The men who wrote that law were not cartoon villains twirling their watch chains. The babies truly had been dying, and everyone with a newspaper knew it. The Red Cross truly had saved them, at real cost, with real skill. The fair contract truly had been predatory, the kind of paper that gets written when a miracle happens to poor people. And the Attorney General of Ontario, a man named Arthur Roebuck, said the government's purpose right out loud, in words worth keeping. The province was acting, he said, to stop racketeering in some vaudeville show. The act itself promised the girls protection, advancement, education, and welfare, and some of the men behind it meant every single word. That is one true reading of March 1935, and it deserves its full weight. The other reading is what actually grew from that law, season by season, on one quiet country road, which the rest of tonight will show rather than argue. Both readings are true at once, the way both sides of a coin are true at once. Protection was the reason. Protection became, in time, the product. If a listener finds both halves hard to hold at once, that is the correct reading, And it was hard for the people of the time as well. Letters to the newspapers ran both ways. Some blessed the province for saving the girls from the sideshow. Some asked, in plainer country language, since when a poor man's babies became the king's. Nobody writing either kind of letter had any idea, yet, what the fence was about to become. We will not settle that argument tonight, and we do not need to. Our job is smaller and kinder. It is to walk the whole road once, end to end, and let the facts say what they say, at a Volume 5 Sleeping Sisters would have approved of. Day to day, the Crown meant a committee. A board of guardians now stood over the girls' lives, empowered to decide where they lived, who touched them, and who saw them. It decided the money too. Around those 5 names, money had already begun to gather. Its membership shifted over the years, the way committee memberships do. The sources disagree politely about who sat in which season. The archives keep no neater list, so neither will we. 2 seats matter for our story. One belonged, constantly, to the country doctor Alan Roy Defoe. He had gone from delivering 3 babies by lamplight to holding legal authority over 5 children. The fame of it was making him the best-known physician alive. The other seat belonged to Oliver Dionne. The record is gentle and brutal at once here, and it needs no decoration. He held a seat at the table that governed his own daughters. It gave him little practical say. A father with a vote he could not win, on a board that ruled his children, about a nursery he could see from his own porch, on land he knew by heart. He kept attending anyway, and then, in time, he mostly stopped. The doctor's authority, it should be said, had been earned the honest way first, in that kitchen, in the dark, with 2 midwives and no equipment. Nobody disputes the debt. What the board did was convert that debt into governance, and governance, unlike gratitude, meets monthly and keeps minutes. Every family in this story will now begin to orbit that piece of paper, so give it one more quiet moment before we move. An act of protection that named 5 babies, a father holding a seat he could not use, a doctor holding a seat he never lost, a mother holding, at this point in the record, nothing official at all. The paper did not hate anyone. Papers never do. It simply arranged the world so that love and authority lived at different addresses, and then it stayed in force while 5 girls learned to walk and read and pray and wave at strangers. The kindest law in Ontario's books that year, and the one whose bill took 63 years to arrive. Keep the addresses straight as we go. Love stayed at the farmhouse. Authority moved across the road. The mail, being sensible, followed the cameras. And so the first act of their lives closed with construction. Through that year, the nursery across the road grew into a compound with a name of its own, the Defoe Hospital and Nursery, and the inventory of it is worth reading slowly, because every item on the list was paid for by the fame of 5 babies, 9 rooms for 5 girls, a separate house for the staff, 3 nurses on rotation so that no hour of the day went unwatched, a housekeeper, 2 maids, and 3 policemen on duty for 5 children who could not yet walk to the end of a porch. Around the whole of it went a fence of woven wire, 7 feet tall, with barbed wire along the top. It was built, everyone agreed, to keep the wrong people out, and after the year this family had lived through, nobody could call that caution foolish. But fences are honest things. They work in both directions, always, and this one would do its quieter second job for 9 years. On one side of the road now stood a farmhouse holding 2 parents and 5 children. On the other, a guarded compound holding 5 daughters and no family at all. In between lay 100 steps of gravel, and by the fence's first winter, those 100 steps might as well have been an ocean. Read that staff list once more, slowly, the way a tired mother across the road might have read it. 3 nurses, a housekeeper, 2 maids, 3 policemen, 8 adults employed around 5 infants, in a province where grown men were lining up for relief work at $1 a day. The arithmetic of it was already saying something out loud. Whatever these children were now, they were no longer only children. And notice, gently, what that inventory replaced. 9 rooms replaced 1 kitchen. 3 trained nurses replaced one exhausted young woman writing on the backs of bills. Steam heat replaced the open door of a wood stove, and a police detail replaced a farm dog and a latch. By every measure a magazine could print, the 5 had been lifted out of poverty into safety, and the photographs would say so for years. The only thing the new building had less of than the old one was family. That was the trade, though nobody wrote it on any form, and the 5 people it most concerned were too small to be asked. A guard at a gate can keep out a promoter. No guard yet invented can let a mother feel needed through 7 feet of wire. Picture the road itself, late on a winter night, after the story's first full year. On the west side, a farmhouse window with lamplight in it. Behind that window, a mother who had carried 5 daughters at once and could hear, on a still night, nothing of them at all. On the east side, floodlit and fenced, a modern nursery where 3 nurses moved from crib to crib on rubber soles. The same 100 steps of gravel lay between them that had always lain between them. A neighbour could walk it in a minute, paper could not. Between those 2 buildings now stood a signed agreement, an act of a legislature, a board of guardians, and the gathering interest of an entire continent. Not one of those things had a door in it. Somewhere in the record of that winter, the distance stopped being geography. It had become policy, and policy, unlike weather, does not break in spring. So ends the first year, and it helps to see the ledger of it laid flat before the noise begins. 5 babies alive who should not have been. 1 young nurse's pencil records, retired to a drawer. 1 void contract, still doing damage. 1 signed agreement, 1 act of a legislature, 1 board of guardians. 1 new compound with steam heat and 8 salaried adults, and 1 farmhouse across the road with a lamp in the window. Every item on that list was assembled in under 18 months, around 5 people who between them could not yet say a full sentence. The depression outside had not lifted an inch, and the letters were already arriving by the sack, from Boston and Butte and Baton Rouge, addressed sometimes to the doctor, sometimes to the nurses, sometimes just to the Quintuplets, Canada. The world had found the little road. The little road was about to be paved for it. Hold that fence in mind as we go, because everything still to come leans against it. The wire went up to protect 5 babies from a circus. What arrived on the far side of it, over the next 7 years, was the largest and politest circus this continent has ever staged. It came by automobile. It bought gasoline, sandwiches, and souvenirs. It wore its Sunday clothes, and it came, on the good days, 3,000 strong before supper. That is the door to the strange years, the ones the title promised. Walk through it slowly with me. Bring the blanket up. The road outside the little compound is about to become famous, and we will watch it happen the way the family did, from the porch, 1 carload at a time. The kettle can go on now. This part takes a while, and it should. The 1st of July 1936 was the country's birthday, and the government of Ontario chose it to open a gallery. Not a gallery for paintings, a horseshoe-shaped corridor, built around the outdoor playground of the Defoe Hospital, with long viewing panels of fine wire mesh set into the inner wall. From the playground side, the mesh read as a dark screen. From the corridor side, it read as a window. In the yard sat a wading pool and a sandbox. Ordinary equipment for an ordinary childhood, except for the wall around it, and the silent line of adults behind the wall. 2 times a day, sometimes 3, the sisters were brought out on schedule. The corridor filled with strangers, and the strangers watched 5 small girls play in the sand. Officially, the children could not see them. The screens were designed to make the watching invisible, so the girls could grow up unaware of being looked at. That was the theory. It was written in good faith, by people who believed observation could be made harmless if it could only be made quiet. Keep that wall of glass and wire in mind. The one-way screen is the truest object in this whole story, and it will come back before the story ends. Think about what had just been built. A government that had taken 5 children into custody, partly to keep them from being shown at a fair in Chicago, had now built, at public expense, a place to show them. The irony was visible from the road. Within the year, the place had a name. The crossroads, the parking lots, the corridor, the little pavilions going up along the gravel shoulder. Together, they came to be called Quintland. No official chose that name. The crowds chose it, the way crowds do, and it stuck because it was accurate. This was not a hospital anymore. It was a land, with a permanent population of 5. The numbers from those summers are period estimates, and this film will treat them as estimates all the way through, rounded rather than audited, because nobody ever sold a ticket that could be counted. Even rounded down, they are hard to believe. On the big days, the people running the place reckoned the crowd at about 3,000. 3,000 people, a full small town, arriving every single day at a gravel crossroads in northern Ontario that a few years earlier had no reason to be on any map at all. Between 1936 and 1943, the estimates run close to 3 million visitors walking that horseshoe corridor. 3 million. This was the middle of the Depression. A tank of gasoline was a considered purchase, a hotel night was a luxury, and a restaurant meal was something a family talked over first. Still they came, month after month, in numbers nobody had planned for. They waited in lines that bent around the fences and out along the road. Farm families and honeymooners, salesmen and nuns, all shuffling forward together in the summer heat for a turn at the mesh. Inside the corridor, people went quiet, the way they go quiet in a church. Hats came off. Voices dropped to whispers. Then each group had its few minutes at the screens, watching the same 5 heads bob over the same sandbox. The line behind pressed them on, and the corridor emptied, and filled again, and emptied, all day long. The crowd itself became part of the spectacle. Photographs from the era give as much film to the visitors as to the children, the sea of hats, the ranked cars shining to the horizon. A compound built to keep 5 children out of public view had become one of the most visited places on the continent. Nobody at the time seemed to find that arrangement strange. That may be the strangest fact of all. Now cross to the other side of the mesh, because the sisters left an account of what the gallery was like from within, and it undoes the official theory in a single sentence. The screens, remember, were meant to make the crowds invisible. The girls were supposed to play on, unaware. Years later, writing together as adults, the sisters remembered it differently. Most of the time we yelled and shrieked with the joy of living, they wrote, and we developed a shrewd idea of what would please the crowds most. Read that second clause again slowly. A shrewd idea of what would please the crowds most. Children of 4 and 5 and 6, who had never once been told an audience existed, had worked out that the dark panels held people and had learned to perform for them. Their account does not say how the knowledge reached them, and this film will not guess at mechanisms the record keeps to itself. Perhaps the mesh was simply less magical than its designers believed. However it happened, the girls knew, and they turned the knowing into a game. So the theory of invisible observation was a comfort for the adults, not a fact of the playground. The watching went both ways. The smallest people in the arrangement understood it first, and nobody had to tell them. It is worth being careful about what this memory does and does not say. The joy in it is real, and so is the shrewdness, and neither one makes a cage ordinary. Their words describe children doing what children always do, finding the game inside whatever world the adults hand them. The world handed them a stage wrapped in wire and told itself they could not tell. They could tell. For the rest of the story, whenever the record says the girls were protected from something, it pays to ask quietly who was actually protected from knowing what. Inside the fence, the days did not merely pass, they were administered. The nursery ran the sisters' childhood on a printed timetable, and the surviving record preserves its shape: orange juice and cod liver oil to start the morning. Inspection at 9 o'clock. Play, but scheduled play, entered on the sheet like a treatment. Baths before 6 in the evening. Prayers in the quiet playroom before bed. Then sleep, then the sheet began again. Every hour had a purpose, and every purpose had an hour. 7 days a week, season after season, year after year. None of it was cruel in itself. Juice, inspection, play, bath, prayer. Any one of those, on any given day, is just a well-run nursery doing its work. The strangeness is in the sum. A childhood with no slack in it anywhere. No morning when breakfast ran late because the stove smoked. No afternoon when nobody watched the clock at all. And no rainy day when the plan was simply abandoned. Across the road, in the farmhouse where they were born, 7 brothers and sisters were growing up the ordinary way, by weather and appetite and their mother's judgment. On this side of the road, 5 girls of the same blood were being raised by the sheet on the wall. Keep the timetable in mind alongside the one-way glass. Those 2 objects, the screen and the schedule, are the whole system in miniature. One decided what the world could see of the girls. The other decided what the girls could do with an hour. Neither one was signed by a parent. The timetable will come back near the end of this story, in a place nobody would wish it, and it will be recognizable when it does. The schedule governed the hours, the measuring governed everything else. In the Defoe hospital, every mouthful of food was counted and entered in the record. So was every diaper. Growth, weight, temperature, behavior, all of it went into charts, because the 5 were not only children here, they were data. Scientists came north to study them. The staff logged them day and night, and the logging never took a holiday. Many years later, the sisters compressed that whole apparatus into one sentence of their own. "We were weighed, measured, tested, studied, and examined," they wrote. 5 verbs. Not one of them is raised, or held, or loved. It is the vocabulary of a laboratory, chosen deliberately by the people who had been its subjects, and it should be allowed to stand as their verdict on those years. Set their sentence beside the nursery's own paperwork, and the 2 describe the same place without touching. The institution recorded ounces gained and hours slept, and could prove on paper that the children were thriving. The children recorded, in memory, what it felt like to be the thing on the scale. Both records are true. That is what makes this part of the story hard, and it is why this film keeps refusing to hand out easy villains. The nurses who counted mouthfuls were keeping 5 fragile children alive by the best science of the day, and in the first winter that counting was heroic. The same counting, continued year upon year on 5 healthy schoolgirls, became something else entirely, something no single person in the building ever sat down and decided to build. A childhood can be saved by measurement and then slowly replaced by it. It happened here, one careful entry at a time, in clean handwriting, by kind people. It is time this story called them by name, one by one, because the world of those years mostly did not. The 5 were Yvonne, Annette, Cecile, Emilie, and Marie, identical sisters, so alike that the nursery gave each girl an assigned colour and a small symbol of her own, and told them apart by the device rather than the face. That system is reported as the nursery's practical invention. The exact table of colours and signs varies a little depending on who remembered it, so this film will not pretend to certainty about which girl wore which. What matters is that it existed at all. Somewhere in a government building, 5 human beings were filed by colour code. To the crowds at the mesh they were the quints, one plural noun, a single marvellous object with 10 eyes. Inside the fence they were 5 separate people, and the differences were real, whatever the marketing needed. The record of those years rarely bothered to learn them. The captions said the quints. The colour codes and the little symbols did the rest of the telling apart, and the girls answered to both, because they had never been offered another arrangement. That neglect of 5 distinct childhoods is its own kind of evidence. A merchandising empire needs a brand, not 5 biographies. So the world got Quintland and the Quints, and 5 of everything in the souvenir stalls, 5 spoons, 5 faces smiling from one calendar page. The plural swallowed the girls whole. Even the nurses, kind as they were, reached for the colours first and the names second. A person can vanish into a group of 5 as surely as into a crowd of 3 million, and these 5 had to do both at once. Hold their names anyway, and hold them in order. Yvonne, Annette, Cecile, Emilie, Marie, Two of those names will carry the heaviest weight of this story long after the crowds go home. By the end, one of them will be the only name left. Here is the detail about Quintland that confuses everyone at first. Admission was free. Nobody ever bought a ticket to the gallery. Ontario could say, truthfully, that it never charged a cent to see the children, and the province said it often, and with some pride. But stand at that crossroads for a moment and follow the money as it actually moved. 3,000 people a day did not float there on goodwill. They drove. On highways the province paved and widened for them, burning gasoline bought at new pumps along the way. They slept in hotels and tourist cabins that had not existed before the births. They ate in restaurants, 3 meals a day, in a region where restaurants had been rare as banks. They bought film for their cameras. They bought postcards for the people back home, and souvenirs from the stands that now crowded the road shoulder to shoulder. Above the crossroads, the money climbed higher, into endorsement contracts and picture rights sold in Toronto and New York boardrooms the girls would never see. The gate was free, the way a spiderweb is free. Nothing at the center asked anything of the visitor. Everything around the center collected. That architecture mattered because it let every level of the enterprise feel clean to the people inside it. The government kept no gate receipts. The hotel keeper just rented rooms. The gas station just sold gas. And the advertising men just licensed a picture. No single hand ever held a ticket stub, and so no single conscience ever had to account for the whole. The whole, meanwhile, was quietly becoming one of the largest commercial phenomena in the country. The next few minutes of this story are about counting it, carefully, with every warning the record demands. In 1938, people who studied such things tried to put a figure on what the 5 girls were worth to the province of Ontario. The estimate they reached was $500 million. Say it plainly, $500 million in the money of 1938 attributed to 5 4-year-olds in a nursery in the North Woods. The yearly tourism take was reckoned as high as $25 million. The direct tourist spending attributed to them across the era was put at more than $50 million. Every one of those figures deserves its warning label, and this film will attach it firmly. They are period estimates, made with the loose arithmetic of boosters and newspapers, and different sources give different totals. Nobody audited Quintland. Nobody was ever going to. But even if the true numbers were half the claimed ones, the shape of the fact survives every correction. During the worst economic collapse in modern memory, 5 children were carrying a measurable share of a province's economy on their backs, and everyone in office knew it. Now compare the 2 ledgers this story has already opened. Dr. Defoe's salary as their physician, at the start, was $200 a month. The trust account that was supposed to hold the children's own earnings will be counted carefully near the end of tonight's story. That counting will not take long. Against those figures stands $500 million in estimated benefit to everyone else. The gap between those numbers is not a detail of this story. It is the story. The rest of these minutes simply walk through where the money went, brand by brand, contract by contract. The girls who generated it were paid in cod liver oil and colored symbols. One comparison from those years has outlived all the estimates because it needs no arithmetic at all. For a stretch of the late 30s, the gravel crossroads at Corbeil drew more visitors than the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. Sit with that for a moment. Niagara Falls, the continent's oldest spectacle, the honeymoon capital, a wonder of the world with a century of railway posters behind it. Outdrawn, beaten at the box office by a wire fence in the spruce country north of North Bay, and beaten not once but season after season, travelers rearranged whole summers around it. The falls had thundered forever and would thunder on, and perhaps that was exactly the problem. The falls were permanent. The 5 girls were now, and growing, and would not be small forever, and the mesh gallery had hours posted like a train station. This film will not stretch the comparison into invented numbers, because the record does not, and the shape of it is enough on its own. A natural wonder lost the box office to a human one. When people in a later century ask how 5 children could possibly have mattered so much to so many, this is the cleanest answer the era left behind. For a while, in the hardest years anyone living could remember, the most visited attraction in Canada was a playground with 5 girls in it. Nothing about that sentence is exaggerated. That is precisely why it is frightening. The crowds were only the visible traffic. The bigger commerce travelled outward, printed on packages, into millions of kitchens that would never see Ontario. The sisters' faces sold Caro corn syrup. Corn syrup, of all things, the same class of kitchen staple that had kept them alive by the dropperful in their first days. And now, a corn syrup company paid to put their faces beside its name. They sold Quaker oats. They sold Palmolive soap and Colgate toothpaste, Lysol disinfectant and Carnation milk. Whatever a careful mother might buy for a healthy child, the 5 most watched children in the world could be photographed endorsing it, and were. And beyond the grocery shelf ran the merchandise itself. Dionne dolls, sold in sets of 5, dressed in 5 little outfits. Calendars for the kitchen wall, 5 faces smiling over every month of the year. Collector spoons, postcards by the crate, candy bars. The trade papers of the day did not publish what each contract paid, and this film will not invent figures where the record keeps none. What the record does keep is the reach. In the middle 30s, it was genuinely difficult to walk through a North American general store without passing the sisters' faces at least once. Probably twice. 5 girls who were not permitted to walk to the end of their own road were, in image, everywhere on the continent at once. Their likeness poured syrup and praised soap in languages they did not speak, in cities they would never visit, on behalf of companies whose checks they would never see. Somebody signed every one of those endorsements. It was never one of the 5 people whose faces did the selling. It was never their mother either. The signatures belonged to the guardianship, and the guardianship signed off on. Even the act of photographing them was owned. A newspaper syndicate arrangement, run through the Toronto Star with the American news agency NEA, bought exclusive rights to photograph the quintuplets. The reported price was $25,000 a year, paid into the quintuplet trust account. The newsreels were metered the same way. Pathy's deposits for filming ran $12,000 to $15,000 a reel. Understand what exclusivity meant on the ground. A stranger with a camera at Quintland was not a tourist taking a snapshot. He was an infringement, trespassing on a licensed image. The girls' faces had become property in the fullest legal sense, fenced by contract, as surely as their playground was fenced by wire. The fence had a rate card. To be fair to the arrangement, those particular dollars, at least, were directed toward the children's own account. Near the end of tonight's story, the record will weigh what finally remained of that account against everything that had passed through it, and the weighing deserves to be done slowly. But notice, right now, who is missing from every signature line? The 5 subjects of the photographs were preschoolers. Their parents, the 2 people a court would ordinarily ask, controlled none of these contracts. The guardians negotiated, the syndicate paid, the newsreel cameras turned on schedule, and the most photographed children of their century had no more say in the use of their own faces than the sandbox had in being photogenic. Every family has pictures. This family's pictures had a price per year, a price per reel, and a lawyer to defend them, before any of the 5 could spell her own name. Step back from the receipts for a moment and look at the machine whole, because its cruelest feature is the one no receipt shows. Nobody owned it. The free gate belonged to the government, the brands belonged to the agencies, the photographs belonged to a syndicate, and the crowds belonged to nobody at all. Each part washed the others clean. The province could point to the empty ticket booth. The advertisers could point to contracts a guardian had lawfully signed. The photographers could point to their license, and every hotel keeper on the highway could point out, correctly, that he had never once met the children he lived on. A machine assembled out of innocent parts had produced, in aggregate, something nobody would have dared propose out loud. Take 5 girls from their parents and run them as a business. Say it that way, and no legislature on earth votes yes. Build it piece by piece, each piece reasonable, each piece defended in the language of protection, and it not only happens, it draws a bigger crowd than Niagara. Notice also what the money never did. It never moved the fence. It never shortened the timetable by an hour, or added a second bathing suit to the wading pool. The $500 million swirled around the compound without ever quite entering it, the way floodwater goes around a post. And the 5 people at the center of the whole economy remained what they had been since the gallery opened. The product, unpaid, unasked, and on time, twice a day, weather permitting. Hollywood arrived in 1936 with a checkbook. 20th Century Fox paid $50,000 for the right to shoot footage of the girls for a feature called The Country Doctor. The actor Gene Hersholt played a kindly northern physician who was Dr. Defoe in everything but name, and the studio barely bothered with the fiction. Audiences were not buying a story. They were buying minutes of the real quintuplets on a screen bigger than a house, and the picture did well enough that 2 more features followed inside 3 years. Be careful with those films as history. They were entertainments, written to formula, and the tender scenes they staged belonged to screenwriters, not to the record. What the films document truthfully is the appetite. A major studio judged that 5 toddlers in Ontario were a bankable attraction beside its own stars, and the box office proved the judgment sound 3 times over. Think about what the $50,000 figure means in the arithmetic this story has been keeping. It was paid for footage, essentially for permission to point cameras at children who could not consent to anything. Measure it against the one salary this record states plainly. $50,000 was, at the start, more than 20 years of Dr. Defoe's original pay at $200 a month. One movie deal, 20 years of doctoring. The nursery stayed the same size through all of it. The wading pool did not get an inch deeper. The money went where the money went, and the girls performed their own lives for one more set of lenses, this time with Klieg lights and a director. When the crews packed up, the timetable resumed as if nothing had happened. Juice, inspection, scheduled play. For everyone else involved, the pictures were an event. For the 5, they were Tuesday. The cameras never really left. In 1939, a short film about the sisters was released under the title 5 times 5, and it was nominated for an Academy Award. It did not win. But pause on the nomination itself, because it completes a circle worth seeing plainly. The motion picture industry's highest honor now had, on its ballot, a film whose entire subject was the daily life of 5 captive children. Their days, the same administered days this story has been describing, had been photographed, assembled, and submitted for a golden statue. Nobody involved meant any harm by it. That has become this story's refrain, and it stays true here too. The filmmakers shot what was there. The Academy voters honored what moved them, and what moved them was real. And one more institution, the most glamorous one yet, folded 5 girls from Corbeil into its own calendar of prizes. Nobody asked the 5 for anything, not even a smile they had not already scheduled. Their childhood was now, officially, an acclaimed motion picture. The people actually living that childhood were 5 years old, and had no say in the matter at all. And what of the country doctor who had delivered 3 of them by lamplight? Remember the salary this story flagged when the guardianship began. Dr. Defoe was engaged to care for the girls at $200 a month. Hold that number in one hand. In the other, hold what the fame brought him. Within a few years, the widowed village physician from Callender had become one of the most famous doctors alive. He toured, he broadcast, he was photographed and quoted and celebrated on 2 continents, and the endorsements and appearances that attached to his name were paid the way fame is always paid. By 1943, the accounting kept during the guardianship years put his documented earnings from that fame at $182,466. The books state the figure exactly, down to the last dollar, and its precision is part of its sting. Somebody kept accounts that careful about the doctor's income from the children, set it against his $200 a month, and the multiplication does itself. To be scrupulous, the figure is what the era's accounting documented, not a full accounting of everything he ever earned or kept, and this film will not inflate it further. It does not need inflating. The man appointed to protect 5 girls from exploitation had become, by the ordinary meaning of the word, the single most successful individual beneficiary of their existence so far counted. And here the story must hold 2 truths at once, the way it held the kitchen and the crowd. By most accounts, his care for the 5 was real, and he argued to the last that the nursery was their safety. The books, meanwhile, say what the books say. Both pages belong to the same man, and the ledger stays open either way. His page in it is now written. The pilgrimage reached all the way to the top of the world's marquees. Clark Gable came to Quintland and looked through the mesh like everybody else. So did James Stewart. Betty Davis made the trip north. James Cagney came. Mae West came. The most photographed faces of the age stood in a plywood corridor in the spruce woods, waiting their turn at the screens. On the far side of the mesh played 5 faces more photographed than any of theirs. The record does not preserve a word any of them said in that corridor, and this film will not put words in their mouths. The image alone carries it. People whose smallest gesture was studio managed knew exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at the only act on the continent with better billing than theirs, and in April of 1937 came The Visitor, whose stop at the gallery reads differently now than it did that spring. Amelia Earhart walked the corridor and watched the girls play. Weeks later, she took off on the flight around the world, from which she never returned. Think of it, one of the last ordinary tourist things the most famous woman on earth ever did was to stand in the dark behind a screen, unseen, and watch 5 little girls who could not see her. Almost no one in this story gets to be only a spectator. Even the spectators turn out to be stories. The corridor held them all for a few minutes each. The stars, the salesmen, the honeymooners, the doomed. Then it moved them along, and the girls yelled with the joy of living and calculated what the shadows would like next. Decades later, the historian Pierre Berton went back through those years and wrote their plainest summary. His history of the era records that in the deepest part of the Depression, the quintuplets effectively became Northern Ontario's industry. Not a curiosity within the economy. The economy. Roads were built and paved because of them. Gas stations opened along those roads. Hotels rose in towns that had never needed hotels. By Berton's accounting, thousands of livelihoods in the region came to hang on one slender thread: the 2 daily viewings of 5 children at play. Follow that framing where it leads, because it explains nearly everything that had begun to feel inexplicable. Once thousands of families eat because the gallery opens on time, the gallery has stopped being a nursery arrangement. It has become infrastructure. Questioning it was no longer sentiment. It was economics. Think of a waitress in North Bay, a pump attendant in Callander, a chambermaid at a new tourist lodge on the highway. None of them had ever signed a guardianship paper. All of them now held a small stake in the girls staying exactly where they were, on view, on schedule, indefinitely. That is Berton's point, made with a historian's calm, and it deserves restating with less calm. The arrangement protected itself. It had distributed its dividends so widely that dismantling it would feel, to an entire region, like closing a mine. Nobody needed to conspire. The parking lots conspired. The hotel registers conspired. The new pavement conspired, mile by mile. When the time finally came to give 5 children back to their mother and father, an industry would have to be shut down to do it. Industries do not shut quietly. Now walk the 100 steps back across the road to the farmhouse this story began in, because what was happening there is the part people flatten worst. Oliver Dionne, the father, opened a souvenir shop directly opposite the nursery that held his daughters. He sold trinkets to the crowds. He sold his autograph. The man who had once said 5, "What am I going to do with 5 babies?" now signed his name for tourists a few steps from the fence. On the other side of that fence lived the 5 children he was not allowed to raise. Meanwhile, he and Elzaya brought up their other sons and daughters in the old house, within sight of the compound, within sound of the crowds. It is the easiest detail in the whole story to sneer at, and for decades many did. The father selling souvenirs of his own confiscated children. What could look worse? But hold the sneer up to the light and it falls apart. Every institution in his world had already turned his family into commerce. The government ran the viewing stand, the doctor took the fame, the syndicates took the pictures, and the brands took the faces. Every one of them was paid, openly and legally, and the man whose kitchen the five were born in was supposed to stand apart on principle, in poverty, and watch it happen. He refused. His refusal took the only form available on his side of the road, a plank counter and a box of trinkets. Before judging him, remember what he never stopped doing through those same years, in petitions and courtrooms and the public press. The souvenir stand and the custody fight were the same man's two hands. This story will not pretend one of them away to make the other simple. If the shop across the road still seems strange, widen the lens one last click, because the record preserves stranger. By the height of it, the rural crossroads had parking lots that could hold thousands of cars at a time. Tour buses came up on fresh highway pavement that existed because the girls existed. And among the stands that lined the road there operated a business called the Midwife's Pavilion. There, two of the women who had helped deliver the quintuplets on that dark May morning sold souvenirs of the event to the passing crowds. The record states the fact, and this film will add no motives to it. Perhaps it was need. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps, in a place where every second building had become a stall, it simply made no sense to be the only witnesses not selling. That is the point worth keeping from the pavilion. By the late 30s, proximity to the birth had itself become a trade. Having been in the kitchen was a credential. Having boiled the water was inventory. The quiet farm road of 1934 now handled charter traffic, and everyone along it had found a stall in the same market. The government, the guardians, the doctor, the syndicates, the father, and now the women who had knelt at the bedside. Individually, every single choice had a reason a fair person could hear out. Together they added up to a world with exactly 5 people in it who earned nothing from being there. And those 5 were the attraction. Nobody had planned that outcome. Nobody was in a position to end it either. The market had no exit, because it had never had an entrance, only a birth. Through all of it, the parents kept fighting, and the fight was slowly finding allies. Oliva pressed legal action against the guardianship, petition after petition, year after year. What had once looked like one stubborn farmer against a popular government began to look different as the 30s wore on. French-Canadian opinion took up the family's cause. Catholic opinion took it up. To French-speaking Canada, the story read as something sharper than a custody dispute. 5 daughters of a French Catholic farm family had been taken by an English-speaking Protestant government. They had been renamed as a scientific and commercial project and displayed for profit. The church and press of French Canada increasingly said so, out loud, in print. The record shows the campaign's motives were mixed, as human motives are. There was principle in it, and grievance, and politics. Entangled with all 3 ran the money that now surrounded the children like weather. This film will not sort those strands into a clean ranking, because the sources do not. What the sources do show is momentum. The claim that 5 girls belonged with their mother and father had been brushed aside in the panic of 1935. Now it was becoming respectable, then popular, then hard to oppose in public at all. Governments can survive being wrong for a long time. They dislike being unfashionable. Somewhere in the late 30s, keeping 5 schoolgirls behind wire against their parents' will began to change shape in the public eye. A proud public health achievement was turning into an embarrassment. Embarrassment, in politics, is the beginning of the end. Here, then, is the honest answer to the question that hangs over these years. Why did it take 7 years to give 5 children back to 2 living, willing, blameless parents? Not because anyone had proven the parents unfit, This record holds no such finding. Not because the girls still needed incubators and specialists. They were sturdy schoolgirls before the 30s were out. It took 7 years because every year the arrangement ran, it acquired new dependents, and none of the new dependents were children. A bureaucracy drew salaries from it. A doctor drew fame from it. A region drew its living from it. And a government drew quiet credit from it in every newsreel. Burton's industry did not want to close, and the industry had votes, and the family had none of them, so the fight was never really parents against guardians. It was a family against an economy, and economies do not surrender to affection. They surrender to pressure, which is why the reunion arrived only after the campaign made the arrangement cost more in shame than it earned in everything else. That is worth saying without bitterness, because it is not a story about wicked men. It is a story about what any system does when its comfort depends on not asking a question. It waits, it files reports, it repaints the fence, and it lets 5 childhoods run out like sand while reasonable people wait for a convenient year. The convenient year came in 1943. The girls were 9. The sand was mostly gone. The turning tide claimed the most famous man in the story first. As the campaign to reunite the family gathered force, Dr. Defoe found himself, for the first time in 7 years, on the unpopular side of the question. He had argued against returning the girls to their parents. He believed, by every account this record keeps, that the nursery was their safety and that he was its guarantor. The parents' allies saw something else. They saw the man who had grown world-famous and comfortably wealthy from the very arrangement he was defending, and they said so, plainly and in public. Amid that dispute, with the custody battle hardening against him, Defoe was pushed out of the story he had commanded. The record frames his exit as resignation and removal tangled together, the way such endings usually are, and this film will not dramatize it beyond what is documented. There was no trial. There was no disgrace in any formal sense. There was simply a morning when the doctor the wire services had called for every bulletin about the most famous children alive no longer spoke for them. Think of what that meant for him. The little doctor and the 5 girls had been the most beloved pairing the newspapers of the 30s ever printed. It ended not with a scene, but with a schedule that stopped including him. He had delivered 3 of them with his own hands in a farmhouse kitchen before dawn in 1934. He left their story before they came home to it. Whatever else is written against his page in this ledger, that exit was its own kind of payment. The record leaves him there, off the stage he had built. The end of Quintland came in 2 distinct steps, and the gap between them matters. In 1941, an Ontario order restored custody to the parents in principle. On paper, the fight was won. In practice, the girls stayed where they were, while a practical question got settled. Where were the reunited parents, quintuplets, and all the other children supposed to live? The old farmhouse could not hold them, neither could the nursery, and nobody wanted that anyway. The answer was built in the meantime, and notice, because it is easy to miss, who paid for it. A 20-room mansion of yellow brick rose near the old property, big enough for both halves of the divided family at last. It was paid for out of the quintuplets' own trust money. The girls bought the house their family would reunite in. 7 years of syndicated photographs and licensed faces had finally purchased one concrete thing for the 5 themselves. The thing was a roof. Their parents and brothers and sisters would live under it too. In November of 1943, the move finally happened. The family walked into the big yellow house together, mother, father, and all the children under one roof, at last. Nothing like it had been true since the stove-warm morning of May 1934. Quintland closed. The gallery stood empty, and stayed empty. The buses stopped coming, the stalls came down season by season, and the crossroads began its long return to being a crossroads. Every fairy tale is supposed to end exactly here. Hold the image of the family at the door of the big house. The next part of this story begins on the other side of that door, and the record of what waited there is the hardest part of this whole night. So the machine stopped. The corridor went dark. The timetable came off the wall, and 9 years of watching were over. But a childhood built by machinery does not become ordinary the day the machinery stops. 5 girls who had never lived in a family were now expected simply to be daughters. The next part of this story is about what happened inside the house the crowds never saw. The house the girls' money built was, by the standards of Corbeil, a palace. Telephones, hot running water, electricity in every room. The rest of the family had never lived with any of those things. The farmhouse across the years had been lamplight and wood stove, and the pump in the yard. Now the Dionnes walked on polished floors under electric light, and the world, which had a name for everything in this story, called the place the Big House. Hold the picture of that first November evening, because on paper it is everything the campaign had fought for. The family together, the government gone, the doctor gone. A warm, wired, modern house, big enough for everyone, bought and paid for. If the story ended here, it would end well. But a house is the easiest part of a home to build. The people who moved into this one were strangers to each other in ways no builder could fix, and every one of them knew it before the first supper was cleared. The parents were taking back daughters they had seen mostly through fences and visits for 9 years, daughters who expected inspection at 9 and prayers on a schedule. The 5 were leaving the only world they had ever known, a world of nurses and schedules and coloured symbols, for a family they knew mostly as faces on the far side of arrangements. 7 brothers and sisters were being handed 5 celebrities and told they were kin. Think of the older ones especially, who could remember the morning the babies were carried out of the kitchen, and who had then spent 9 years watching the road fill with cars that never came for them. Every person under that roof had been wronged by the same 9 years. None of them had been wronged in the same way, and wounds that do not match make poor company. The big house had every luxury of 1943. What it did not have, and could not buy at any price, was a single shared memory of an ordinary day. The sisters gave their verdict on that house in one sentence, years later, and the sentence has outlived every press release ever written about the reunion. They called the mansion the saddest home we ever knew. Sit with their words, because they chose them carefully. Not the strictest home, not the strangest or the loneliest, though by their telling it may have been both. The saddest. And notice the word home, offered without irony even so. It was their home. They wanted it to be one. That is what the sentence mourns. The reunion of 1943 was supposed to be the happy ending, the correction of the great wrong, the family restored to itself at last. The world certainly took it that way. It celebrated the homecoming, and satisfied with the ending, moved on to the war and other news. The file was closed. The wrong was righted. 9 years of fences ended in a doorway, and everyone outside the doorway went home happy. The 5 people at the center of the celebration experienced something else, something it would take them decades to say out loud. They had been rescued from an aquarium and delivered to a courtroom, a house where the past sat down to dinner every night, and nobody had the language to mention it. In the nursery they had at least been the center of a system that, whatever else it did, was built around their days. In the big house they were 5 reminders of everything the family had suffered, 5 walking receipts for the fence and the crowds and the missing years. The saddest home we ever knew. The stretch of story ahead is simply that sentence, unpacked one room at a time. Begin with the wall nobody could see. The nursery had raised the 5 in English. The doctor spoke English, most of the staff worked in English, and the girls grew up thinking and playing and praying in it. Across the road, the family lived in French, as their parents had, as Corbeil largely did. So when the 5 came home, they came home to parents they could not easily talk to. The sources are careful here, and this film will match their care. It was a barrier, not a total silence. Words crossed the gap. Meals were managed. Instructions were given and followed, and the 2 languages surely leaked into each other across the years of shared rooms. But imagine the texture of it, day after day. A mother who had fought 9 years for her daughters, reaching for them at last, and finding that the words she loved in were not the words they answered in. A father giving a household order twice, once wrongly. Children who could not follow the fastest, warmest talk at their own dinner table, the teasing, the old family shorthand, the jokes that had been running since before they were born. Jokes explained are not jokes. Comfort offered through a wall of grammar arrives cold. The government had not merely taken 5 children from a family. It had, without ever intending it, taken the family's language out of the children, so that even the reunion arrived needing translation. Of all the bills that came due in the big house, this one may have been the cruelest, because nobody had chosen it and nobody could pay it. Love was present. Everyone who studied that household agrees love was present. On both sides of the wall, it just could not always find the words, in either direction, and a family is made of words more than anyone admits until the words are gone. Inside the house, by the sisters' own published account, the 5 were set apart and set to work. They described hard household labor that fell on them, while their brothers and sisters carried lighter loads, and they reached for a fairy tale to name it, saying they were made scrubbing Cinderellas in their own home. That is their phrase, and it should be heard exactly as they said it. Scrubbing Cinderellas. This film will be careful about what that account is and is not. It is the sisters' testimony, published as adults, about how those years felt from inside their own hands and knees. It is not a court's finding about their parents' intent, and the record does not deliver one, and none will be invented here. A household of 14 in 1940s farm country ran on chores, all of it, every child included, and nobody in Corbeil would have blinked at girls scrubbing floors. What the sisters describe is not that chores existed, it is that the work was sorted, that the 5 felt marked out for the heavy share, singled out in the one place that was supposed to finally treat them like everyone else, and that the house never let them forget they were different. Perhaps the parents were evening an old score with fate. Perhaps they were trying, clumsily, to scrub the princess out of 5 girls the world had spoiled, to make them ordinary, the only way a farm family knew how. Perhaps it was nothing so deliberate, only the friction of 14 people and one unspeakable history under a single roof. The sisters' account and the parents' conduct have to share this paragraph, and they do not reconcile, and this film will not force them to. What survives either way is the image the 5 chose for themselves. Cinderella, in the story, is the daughter of the house treated as its servant. They picked that figure, they picked it in the plural, they never took it back. Here is the turn nobody in 1934 could have predicted. The thing that saved the 5 in that house was the very thing the nursery had done to them. They kept to themselves. A family within the family, 5 girls who moved as one, ate together, whispered together, and closed ranks the moment any room turned cold. By their own telling, the closeness that the nursery had forced on them, 5 cribs, 5 identical dresses, 5 names on one schedule, had become the only home they trusted, not the farmhouse they were born in, not the mansion their money built. Each other. This film will keep that claim exactly where the sisters kept it, as their telling of their own hearts, not as anyone's diagnosis, because nobody gets to diagnose these 5 from the outside, then or now. But notice what their telling means for the shape of the story. Every institution had failed them by now, each in its own respectable way. The government's protection had become a show with posted hours. The doctor's care had become a career with its own accounting. The family's rescue had become the saddest home they ever knew. The only arrangement that never betrayed them was the accidental one, the sisterhood itself, the 4 other faces that were her own face. From any seat in the circle, nobody had designed that bond. The nursery had built it as a side effect, the way a prison yard builds friendships, by giving people nothing but each other and years to practice. It turned out to be the only thing anyone built in all those years that held. Remember this 5-sided fortress, and remember that it was made of survivors. The rest of the story is, in large part, the record of what it cost to live inside it, and what happened as, one by one, its walls came down. Step back once, briefly, and name what the reunion had actually asked of everyone, because no one at the time seems to have named it. It asked 2 households, raised on opposite sides of a fence for 9 years, to become one family by walking through a door. It asked parents to resume an intimacy that had been confiscated when their daughters were newborns, and to do it in a second language. It asked 5 girls to unlearn the only childhood they had, to stop being a 5-pointed institution and start being daughters and sisters, roles they had seen only through wire. It asked 7 other children to absorb the 5 most famous people in the country as roommates, and to feel no arithmetic about whose faces had paid for the house. And it asked all of this of people who had every reason to love each other and no practice at it. The marvel is not that the big house became the saddest home they ever knew. The marvel is that anyone expected otherwise. A government that had spent 9 years and a fortune building the separation spent nothing at all on the reunion. No counsel, no help, no gradual bridge, so far as any page shows. 5 children were moved across the road like the last item on a docket, and the door closed, and the country called the case complete. The family inside was left alone with the bill for everything the previous 9 years had bought. They paid it in the only currency available to them, which was each other. School might have been a door out of the compound world. It was arranged, instead, as one more room of it. A schoolhouse inside the grounds was accredited for the 5, so that even their education happened within the family's walls, under the family's eye. For the later grades, 7 local Catholic girls were brought in to be their classmates. Think about the shape of that solution, because it is the old shape, wearing a school uniform. Ordinary children walk out their front door to school and meet the world, with its strangers and its risks and its glorious indifference. For the Dionne 5, the world was selected, counted, vetted, and walked in to meet them. 7 approved girls, from approved families, imported into the enclosure like everything else the 5 were ever permitted to touch. It was kindness, of a kind, and this film will say so. Somebody understood that the sisters needed faces their own age that were not their own face. Somebody arranged it, and the arrangement surely brought real friendship and real laughter into those rooms, and the record leaves the 7 their privacy, so this film will too. But the deeper pattern is the point, because by now it has followed the girls through 3 regimes without once breaking. In the nursery, the crowd came to the glass. In the big house, the classmates came to the schoolroom. Always the mountain to the 5, never the 5 to the mountain. They were approaching womanhood and had never yet walked into a room that was not prepared for them, never been a stranger anywhere on earth. Whatever leaving home would eventually mean for these sisters, it would mean doing, at 18, something no one had ever taught them or let them practice, walking into a world that did not expect them. One more thing happened in those big house years, and this story will say it the way the sisters said it, once, and move with care. In September 1995, half a century afterward, the 3 surviving sisters, Annette, Cecile and Yvonne, stated publicly, on Canadian television and in wire reports, that their father had sexually abused them in their teenage years. They described gropings on car rides. They said that when they told a chaplain, he advised them to love their parents and to wear thick coats in the car. That is their account, told in their words, at the level they chose to tell it, and it will not be elaborated here. The record requires 2 more sentences beside it. Other siblings publicly denied the allegations, and Oliver Dionne, who died in 1979, was never charged with any offence and had no chance to answer what was said 16 years after his death. This film holds what it has always held, both pages at once. The man who fought a government for his daughters and the man his daughters described in 1995 are claims that cannot be reconciled, only reported, and the reporting is now done. What the chaplain's answer documents, beyond dispute, is the world the girls lived in. They did tell someone. The someone told them to dress warmly. Whatever else was true in that house, the 5 had learned, one more time, that telling changed nothing, and they did not speak of it again for 50 years. At 18, they left. In 1952 and 1953, the 5 went away to study in Quebec, to convent schooling, and what followed is mostly a history of distance. Afterward, They kept the thinnest contact with the big house. Visits grew rare, then rarer, then largely ceremonial. Nothing in the surviving pages describes a dramatic scene. No slammed door, no declaration of estrangement, and this film will invent none, because none is needed. The five simply went, the way water goes when a gate is finally lifted, and they did not really come back. For girls who had never once walked into an unprepared room, the leaving itself was the bravest act of their lives so far. How little they returned shows how completely they meant it. One detail from those school years does the work of 100 pages, and it is a detail about money. At the convent school, the quintuplets' allowance was $2 a month. $2, pocket money for stamps and soap. At that same hour, the trust account carrying their name held a fortune they had never been shown, never been read a statement from, never been taught to imagine. Every photograph since 1934, every newsreel reel, every endorsement this story counted through Quintland's years had been paid into a fund kept perfectly out of their sight. The 5 young women it belonged to were budgeting $2 a month, pooling coins like any poor students, unaware they were rich. Nobody had ever needed to lie to them about the money. It was enough that nobody had ever told them the truth. Keep those $2 beside the unseen fortune. That pairing, the pocket change and the invisible account, is the whole remainder of this story in miniature. When the account finally becomes visible, the arithmetic will be worse than anyone guessed. Emilie chose God. Of the 5, she was the one who turned toward the religious life, and she entered it as a postulant. For a little while her story looked like the first one to land somewhere chosen rather than assigned. A vocation is a door a person opens from the inside, and Emilie, who had spent her whole life on the wrong side of arranged doors, had opened one. She carried a secret through it, because the family had carried it for years, carefully, the way the times demanded. Emilie had epilepsy. In that era, the condition drew a stigma cruel enough that it was managed in silence, inside the household, away from the public that believed it knew everything about these 5 bodies. The world that had watched her gain every ounce, that had once known her weight to the ounce, had never been told the one medical fact that mattered. Consider that trade for a moment. Her seizures were private. Nothing else ever had been. In August 1954, she was at a convent rest house near Saint Agathe. She was 20 years old. During a seizure, alone, she died. Her face turned into her pillow. The documented circumstances end there, and so will this telling of them. No invented final day. No imagined last words. A 20-year-old woman, the first of the 5 to reach for a life of her own choosing, gone in a quiet room far from every camera on earth. The child the whole world had watched died with no one watching. For the 4, something ended that had never ended before. Since the wicker basket by the stove door, whatever happened had happened to 5. 5 weighed together, 5 photographed together, 5 moved, schooled, displayed, and returned together. Now, for the first time since the morning they were born, they had to be a number they had never once practiced. 4. The 4 survivors were photographed at her funeral. Of course they were. Stand back far enough, and the shape of it is almost unbearable. This story began with a one-way screen, built so that crowds could watch 5 children without being seen, and the childhood behind that glass became the most photographed on Earth. The story promised the screen would come back, and here it is. The cameras found them again, grown women in black, burying the first of themselves. The glass had returned in its adult form, a lens at a graveside. The world's most photographed childhood had become a procession of goodbyes, and that framing belongs to this narrator, not to any mourner standing there, but the pictures themselves are fact, printed and preserved. 4 identical faces around a coffin holding the 5th. No wire mesh now, no horseshoe corridor, no posted viewing hours, no souvenir stand at the gate. Just the oldest arrangement in the story, reassembled in a cemetery, unticketed and unfenced and unchanged. The watchers and the watched. It would not be the last time. The circle would shrink again, and the watching never fully stopped, because the world never did learn another way to love them. From the sandbox to the graveside, the deal had never changed. Their presence was public property. Only their grief had finally become their own, and even that was worth a photograph. 9 months after the funeral, the money finally surfaced. At 21, the age of majority, the survivors were told at last what the trust held: over $1 million. Read that against the $2 allowance of 3 years before. It was the first time in their lives anyone had shown them the account that had been collecting their childhood since 1934. This story watched that account fill, real fee by real fee, through Quintland's years. And in the same season they learned the number. Their father pressed them to sign agreements that would keep him in control of the fund. The documented sequence runs as follows, and this film will not color it beyond the record. Cecile refused first. Within a week, all 4 had signed. That is what the sources preserve, the refusal and the signing, 7 days apart, and whatever passed inside that week is left undescribed in every surviving telling, so it stays undescribed here. But place the scene where it actually sits in this story, because its weight comes from everything already told. These were 4 women raised to obey schedules they did not write, in houses they did not choose, by authorities they were never once permitted to question. They had been out of the big house for 3 years, and out of the nursery for 12, and no year of any of it had taught them that refusal worked. The man across the table was their father, the man who had beaten a government, also the man from whose house they had walked at 18 and barely returned. Whatever happened inside that week, the outcome is the fact. The fortune their faces had earned stayed, for now, in the hands that had run the souvenir stand. The account was theirs on paper. Paper, in this family, had never once meant control. Now count what remained, because the numbers tell the end of the economic story in 3 steps, and every step is documented as a range rather than an exact accounting, because no clean count was ever made. The childhood of the Dionne Quintuplets had generated millions upon millions. Quintland at its height had been valued to the province in the hundreds of millions. Of all that, the trust in the girl's name held roughly $1 million when they came of age. By 21, after the fees and the years, about 800,000 remained. The figures vary by source and by year, and this film gives them as the documented range and nothing firmer. But the direction of the arithmetic is not in dispute anywhere, in any source, friendly or hostile. Follow it down, step by step. An economy in the hundreds of millions, built entirely on 5 children. A trust of roughly 1 million reaching their adulthood, 800,000 surviving their 21st year. And decades ahead, in the 1990s, the elderly survivors of the most profitable childhood in Canadian history would be found living on a few $100s a month. Hold that last figure. It is where this staircase is going, and the story will meet it properly before the end. Each step downward has its explanations, its administrators, its perfectly filed receipts. Nobody was ever convicted of anything. The money did not vanish in one dramatic theft, which is precisely why no one could ever be arrested for it. It seeped, through salaries and guardians' fees and management and time, the respectable way fortunes leave people who were never allowed to hold them. The 5 had been the engine of everything, and the owners of almost nothing. The gap between those 2 facts is where the rest of this story lives. Put the leaving, the signing, and the seepage side by side, because together they finish an education this story has been tracking since the wicker basket. From birth, the 5 were taught, by arrangement after arrangement, that their lives belonged to processes other people ran. The nursery taught it with a timetable, the gallery taught it with a wall of screens, the big house taught it with chores and silence, and the chaplain's answer taught it in a single sentence. So when 4 young women finally sat before the fund their faces had filled, everything in their training pointed one way. Sign. Cecile's refusal, 1 woman, 1 week, against that entire education, deserves to be remembered as the act of nerve it was, and so does the fact that the education won. It had always won. The deeper lesson of the staircase of figures is the same one. At every landing, The people responsible could show that each deduction was proper, each fee earned, each salary approved, and the sum of all that propriety was 5 children's fortune draining quietly away while its owners budgeted pocket change. Nothing about the machine had changed since Quintland. It had only changed clothes. The viewing stand became a signing table. The gate that charged nothing became a fund that paid nothing out. And the girls remained what they had always been to every system that touched them, the asset. The last part of tonight is about the sisters who finally refused that word, out loud, in public, with nothing left to lose but the story itself. Life went on, because it does. The survivors married, and the record keeps the outlines, and the outlines are worth hearing as the ordinary music they almost were. Annette married Germaine Allard and raised 3 sons. Cécile married Philippe Langlois and bore 5 children, and buried her son Bruno in infancy, a grief the record notes, and this film will not disturb further, except to say that she, of all people, knew what it was to lose one of 5. Marie married Florian Houle and had 2 daughters. Ordinary names, ordinary milestones, weddings and christenings and school mornings, the very things the wire services had once promised the world, these 5 would never quite have. And then, in time, each of those marriages ended, in separation or divorce. Every one of them. The sources do not explain the endings, and no blame will be assigned here, to anyone, in any direction. What the pattern invites is not judgment, but memory. Remember what these women had been given as a model of what love looks like. A doctor who adored them and profited from them. A government that protected them in a display case with posted hours. A family that fought for them across 9 years and then could not find the words, in the right language, in the saddest home they ever knew. Every intimate bond they had ever witnessed came wrapped around an account book or a fence. That they reached for marriage and motherhood at all, 4 women raised by Timetable behind glass, was itself a kind of courage the record undersells. That the marriages struggled is a fact this story sets down gently and leaves alone. The sisterhood, the 5-sided fortress, now 4-sided, remained what it had always been, the bond that held when the others did not. Hold the last image of these years where the cameras held it. 4 women in black at a graveside, photographed, watched even in grief. The fortune is signed away. The fortress is 4-sided now, and the world believes the story is over. It is not over. What remains belongs to the ledger, and to the sisters who lived long enough to make a government open it. The last act of this story is a ledger, and the sisters opened it themselves. In the middle of the 1960s, the 4 survivors published a memoir, written with the author James Bruff, and they gave it a title that does most of the book's work on its own. We Were 5. 3 words, all of them load-bearing. We, because the voice was finally theirs, after 30 years of captions and press releases written by other hands. Were, because the past tense had been earned the hard way in a convent rest house near Saint Agathe. And 5, because that was the number the world had broken and no book could repair. It was the first time the public heard the inside of the story it thought it knew by heart. The nursery, the gallery, the big house, told at last from behind the mesh, by the people the mesh had held. The book did not shout. It did not need to. The facts, plainly set down, were their own indictment, and the reading public that had once mailed in box tops for Dionne calendars now read what the calendar years had actually contained. A world war had come and gone since Quintland, and the crowds of the 30s were middle-aged now, and many of them surely remembered standing in that horseshoe corridor with their hats off. Now they learned what the yelling on the far side of the glass had been, not joy alone. Performance, by children who had worked out what the shadows wanted. The title told the arithmetic. The book told the cost. Out of everything the sisters ever wrote, 2 sentences have become the epitaph of the whole affair, and they deserve to stand alone. Money was the monster. So many around us were unable to resist the temptation. That is their published verdict, word for word. And notice what it does and does not do. It does not name their father. It does not name the doctor, or the premier, or the guardians, or the advertising men. though every one of them had a page in the story. The sisters, who had more right than anyone alive to hand out blame, chose instead to name the force. Money was the monster, not a villain but a weather, a temptation that so many around us, their phrase again, simply could not withstand. Test their sentence against everything already told tonight, and it holds at every point. The government that kept the gallery open while a region fed on the traffic, the doctor whose devotion and whose fortune grew from the same nursery, the father with the souvenir counter and the signing table, the syndicates, the brands, the midwives with their pavilion. Not one of them set out to harm 5 girls, and nearly every one of them, offered the monster's terms, took them. The sisters' mercy in those lines is almost harder to bear than anger would be. They looked back at the whole crowded stage of their childhood and concluded that the people had been ordinary. It was the temptation that had been extraordinary, and nobody in Ontario had built a fence against that. Fences, in this story, had only ever been built around the wrong thing. Marie tried to build something small and her own. In Montreal, she opened a flower shop, and she named it for the sister the 5 had buried. Salon Emilie. Sit with that name on a shop window for a moment. A woman who had been sold on syrup tins and cinema screens chose to put one name above her door, and it was not her own, and it was not a brand. It was her dead sister, remembered in flowers, around Mother's Day of all seasons. The shop did not last. The era's pages keep no long story about it, only that it opened with hope and closed without it. One small business among the thousands that fail, except that nothing about this proprietor was ever allowed to be small. Her marriage to Florian Houle ended in separation in 1966. 2 daughters stayed with her heart, whatever the living arrangements became, and the pages leave the private grief of those years mostly private, which is where this film will leave it too. But mark the pattern, because it is the same one the act before this traced. The 5 kept reaching for ordinary life, the shop, the marriage, the quiet street. Ordinary life kept coming apart in their hands, like a language they had been prevented from learning at the age when learning is easy. A flower shop named for a dead sister is not a business plan. It is a memorial with a cash register, kept by a woman who had never once been taught that anything, even grief, could simply belong to her. In February of 1970, Marie was found dead in her Montreal apartment. She was 35 years old. She had been dead for days before anyone found her. The cause is reported variously: a blood clot in the brain in most tellings, a stroke in others, and this film will leave it at the hedged truth the pages allow. What it will not soften is the sentence at the center. Days, a woman who had been watched by 3 million strangers, whose first breaths had been international news, whose survival had once been the whole world's good news, lay dead in an apartment in a great city. Days passed before any person noticed. There is no crueler measurement anywhere in this story of the distance between being seen and being known. The world had never stopped recognizing Marie Dionne. It had simply never learned to check on her. She was the second of the 5 to go, and the first, Emilie, had also died alone. The fortress of 5 was down to 3 now: Yvonne, Annette and Cécile, and they were not yet 40. Whatever the actuarial tables promised 5 healthy girls born in 1934, this family was burying its members young, one quiet room at a time. The father, who had once asked what he was going to do with 5 babies, now had 3 living daughters from that morning. The crowds of Quintland were a distant memory by 1970. The grief was not. The parents' generation closed next. Oliva Dionne died in 1979. Elzire followed in 1986. The pages record the dates and little else that this story can verify. There will be no invented deathbed scenes here, no final words, no late absolutions. None are documented, and this family has been given enough fiction for 1 century. What can be said plainly is what the dates close. The reconciliation the family never fully found in life ended there, unfinished. Whatever conversations might someday have untangled the big house years, the language wall, the chores, the signatures, the shop across from the fence, they did not happen, and now they never would. Oliver went to his grave a man history could not settle on, the wronged father of 1934, the souvenir merchant of Quintland, the presser of signatures at the trust table, and, 16 years after his death, the man his 3 surviving daughters would describe on national television. All of those men were buried in one grave, and no court, no historian, and no film untangles them now. Elzire's page is quieter, the mother who said Holy Mary over 5 impossible babies, who fought 9 years to get them back, and who got back, in the end, 5 strangers who left at 18. Between her husband's death and her own, she lived 7 years, the last parent of the most famous children on earth, in a far quieter world than the one that had once camped at her fence. The little house where she gave birth would end its days as a museum. Her daughters were already history. She outlived the story that had consumed her family. Between those 2 deaths, in 1984, Cecile sat for a television interview and said the sentence that historians now reach for first when they want the whole story in one line. Because of the accident of birth, we were not considered people. Date it, because she said it in 1984, 50 years exactly after the accident in question. Half a century of hindsight, compressed by one of the 5 into 11 words. Not considered people. Consider how precisely that phrase fits every institution this story has walked through. People are asked. The 5 were scheduled. People own their faces. Theirs were licensed by the year and metered by the reel. People inherit their wages. Theirs seeped away through fees, while they budgeted $2 a month. People bury their sisters privately. The 5 buried Emilie in front of cameras. At every fork, for 50 years, the world had chosen the arrangement over the person, and it had done so, mostly, while calling itself their protector. The accident of birth. That is the other half of Cecile's sentence, and it may be the more forgiving half. She does not say the world hated them. It never did. It adored them, the way a country adores a windfall, and a windfall is a thing, and things are managed, displayed, insured, and spent. 1984 was also the 50th year since the lamp-lit kitchen at Corbeil. Cecile's interview arrived in the middle of that golden anniversary, like a stone through a window. The miracle, said the miracle, had never been considered a person. In April of 1995, the 3 surviving sisters stopped asking history for its verdict and went to court for one. Yvonne, Annette, and Cecile sued the province of Ontario for $10 million for what the filings and the coverage called a lost childhood. That same autumn they published a second book, Family Secrets, and told the story in their own words, harder words than the memoir of the 60s had used. They wrote that they had been taken hostage, that they had been deprived of personal liberty, that they had been financially exploited until their majority. Those are the published phrases, and this film adds no legal conclusions of its own to them. But hear the middle phrase with the ears this story has earned. Deprived of personal liberty. The women who wrote that had lived by a printed timetable that decided what a child did with every hour. The schedule this story promised would return, has returned, exactly where nobody would wish it, inside a statement of claim. Juice, inspection, scheduled play, baths before 6, prayers, filed now as evidence of a childhood administered instead of lived. 60 years is a long time to wait to say a thing that plainly. It took that long because the courts of the 30s would not have heard it, and the sisters of the 50s had been trained not to say it, and the world in between had been busy remembering Quintland fondly. 3 women in their 60s finally put the whole apparatus on notice. The province that had built the gallery would now be asked, under oath and in public, what it had done with the children and what it had done with the money. Both questions had waited 60 years for a courtroom. Only one of them would ever get a full answer. Then, in December 1997, history handed the sisters a mirror. In Iowa, the McCaughey septuplets were born, 7 babies at once, and the world's cameras turned toward a farm family blinking in the flashbulbs, and every element of 1934 assembled itself again on cue. The marveling coverage, the commercial circling, the instant fame of people who had asked for none of it. The three surviving sisters watched it begin again, and they did something they had never done in 63 years. They intervened. They published an open letter in Time magazine, addressed to the septuplets' parents, from, in their own written words, women whose lives had been ruined by exploitation. The letter's warning ran close to this. Multiple births should not be confused with entertainment, and they should not become an opportunity to sell products. Read who is speaking, and the letter becomes one of the most quietly devastating documents in this whole affair. Three women in their 60s, writing to two strangers in Iowa, essentially saying, "We are what happens next if the world gets its way. Guard your children." We were not guarded. It was the Fortress of Five doing the only thing left in its power, standing between the machine and somebody else's babies. Nobody in 1934 had stood there for them. No former exhibit had written to Oliva and Elzira to warn them what a grateful world does to miracle children. The sisters wrote the letter they had needed to receive, 63 years too late for themselves, and exactly on time for Iowa. In doing so, they turned their whole catastrophe into somebody else's fence. Notice what had happened across these 30 years, because it is the quietest big event in the whole story. The five had become the authors of it. Every stage of their childhood had been narrated by somebody else. The doctor gave the bulletins. The government wrote the rules. The syndicates captioned the photographs, and the advertisements put words in five mouths too young to argue. Then, sentence by sentence, the women took the pen. A memoir in the 60s, signed "We." A verdict in the 80s, 11 words long, spoken into a television camera. A book in the 90s called Family Secrets, with the hard phrases finally in print. A letter to Iowa, warning strangers away from the path. And a lawsuit, which is, after all, only a story told in a courtroom, with the teller finally under oath and the listener finally required to answer. The world had spent decades asking what the quintuplets were worth. The sisters spent their last decades answering a better question, which was what the whole arrangement had actually been. Hostage-taking, they wrote. Not considered people, Cecile said. Ruined by exploitation, the letter said. The words grew plainer as the women grew older, and the plainer the words became, the more the country believed them. That is the machinery of the reckoning still to come. Nothing about the past could be changed anymore. The only thing left to fight for was who would get to describe it, and the five, who had lost every other contest their century staged for them, won that one completely. Every history written since, this one included, stands on the account they finally gave. The letter, the lawsuit, and the coverage did what 50 years of quiet had never done. They made the arrangement expensive again, this time in shame. Ontario tried to settle small. The province's early offers, first a monthly stipend, then sums in the low millions, were refused, and the refusals themselves were news, because the public had finally turned. The people of the 90s looked at the photographs their grandparents had taken at the Mesh, and they saw what the 30s had somehow not seen. 3,000 a day, watching two little shows. The outrage that followed was a country recognizing itself in an old album. In March of 1998, it ended. Premier Mike Harris met the surviving sisters face to face, apologized on the province's behalf, and settled at $4 million, with a review of the trust records attached. Measure that scene against the beginning. In 1935, a premier's government had taken 5 babies by act of law and built a fence around them. In 1998, a premier sat across from the 3 women those babies had become and said, for the province, that it had been wrong. 64 years, less 2 months, from the Guardianship Act to the apology. The fence this story has followed since the year the wire went up was finally repaid in words, spoken by the office that had built it. $4 million against the $500 million once credited to their childhood invites its own bitter arithmetic, and the sisters knew the numbers better than anyone. They took the apology. By every account, it was the apology, not the check, that they had gone to war for. Money had been the monster all their lives, and they were not going to let it be the meaning of their victory too. What they wanted on the table was the admission. They got it, in person, from the province's first minister, while the country watched them win. The review of the trust records came with a finding that explains why this story has counted so carefully in Rangers all night. The Guardianship's financial books from the first years, 1934 to 1937, had been destroyed. Burned pages, from precisely the years when the machine was built, when the syndicate contracts were signed, when the endorsement money ran fastest. The pages that survive do not say who destroyed them, or exactly when, and so this film will accuse no one, which is exactly the problem. Nobody can be accused. That is what the destruction of a ledger buys. What was taken from the five in those loudest years can never now be fully counted, not by the province's reviewers, not by historians, not by this story. The arithmetic of their childhood has a hole burned in its center, permanent and deliberate-looking and forever unattributable. Hold the shape of the whole settlement in one hand, then an apology, freely given, 64 years late, $4 million, a fraction of a fraction, and a confession, in the passive voice of missing paper, that the full bill can never be known. The sisters had asked the province what it had done with the children and what it had done with the money. The province answered the first question like an adult, at last. The second question had been answered decades earlier, by somebody with a match, and the answer was that no one would ever answer it. In a story starved for villains, the burned books are the closest thing to a confession anyone ever made. Every other wrong in these 90 years can be argued as good intentions gone bad. Not this one. Good intentions keep their receipts. Someone, sometime, decided those particular years should not survive. The fire kept the secret. It keeps it still. So what is the verdict on Quintland, now that the whole account is open? The historians split, and the split itself is the truest summary this story can offer. Pierre Berton, who documented those years more thoroughly than anyone, concluded that the quintuplets saved an entire region from bankruptcy. That is one true sentence. The roads, the hotels, the livelihoods, the depression survival of a corner of Ontario, all of it real, all of it standing on 5 cribs. The author Sarah Miller, looking at the same years, called the design of their childhood hypocritical at its core. That is also one true sentence. A government that seized children to stop their exhibition and then built the exhibition itself has no honest defense, only explanations. Both verdicts are attributed, both are quoted at their level, and this film declines to choose between them, because the story does not require a choice. It requires arithmetic. Add what Burton counts. A region fed, thousands of livelihoods carried. A nation cheered through its darkest decade. Then subtract what Miller names. 5 childhoods, administered instead of lived. The region got through the 30s. The 5 never got an unwatched morning. Whether that trade was worth making depends entirely on which side of the mesh a person stood, and that has been the geometry of this story since the first pane went in. The crowds and the waitresses and the gas station men were never wrong that the girls were a blessing. The girls were never wrong that the blessing was billed to them. History's ledger closes with both entries standing, unreconciled, the way honest books sometimes must. The century turned, and the fortress kept shrinking. Yvonne died of cancer in June of 2001, at 67. Her obituaries told a life this story has had too little room for, and it deserves its minute now. She had trained as a nurse, the watched child grown into a watcher over others. She worked later as a sculptor and as a librarian, hands that had been photographed holding dolls, finally shaping clay and shelving quiet books in rooms where nobody stared. She never married. Of the 5, Yvonne built the life most fully outside the story, and the pages respect it mostly with silence, which may be the only privacy the world ever fully granted one of them. Her illness will not be elaborated here. Cancer, at 67, in June of 2001. With her, the 3 became 2. Annette and Cecile, the 2 youngest heads from the wicker basket, were now the entire living memory of the Defoe nursery, of Quintland's corridors, of the big house, of the signing table, of the Premier's apology. Two women held all of it. Every corridor, every signature, every funeral. Each was the other's last witness, and what one forgot, the world lost. They had buried Emilie at 20, Marie at 35, and now Yvonne at 67. And between those funerals, they had taken on a government and won the only apology this story contains. What remained to them was quiet at last, and one final public campaign, which turned out to be about the smallest building in this entire story. Stand at Yvonne's grave a moment before the story moves on, and look at the pattern the 5 deaths were drawing, because the pattern is the indictment nobody ever filed. The most accompanied children on earth kept dying alone. Emilie, at 20, in a room with nobody. Marie, at 35, undiscovered for days in a city of millions. Yvonne, at 67, after decades spent building a life deliberately outside the spotlight, in work that asked nothing of her famous face. 3 million people had waited in line to watch these women play. Whole industries had been erected on their togetherness. 5 of everything, 5 faces on one calendar page, and not one structure from all of it stood close enough to catch them when they fell. The crowd, it turns out, was never company. Being watched, it turns out, was never once being held. The world had practiced looking at the Dionne sisters for so long and with such pleasure that it mistook the looking for love, and the mistake only became visible at the deaths, when the looking stopped and nothing else was there. Against that emptiness stood the one bond this story has trusted from the beginning: each other. The survivors buried each sister as she went, closed that seat in the circle, and carried the memory forward for the ones who could not. 5, then 4, then 3, then 2. The fortress was never conquered, it was simply outlived, wall by wall, and every wall that fell made the remaining ones more precious, until the whole structure was 2 old women in Quebec holding a century between them. The smallest building was the first one. The little farmhouse where 5 girls were born by lamplight had refused, all along, to leave this story. It had been moved twice across the decades, carried whole down the roads its own fame had paved. It ended up as a museum, a keeping place for the story's beginnings. Then, in 2016, the museum closed. Money again, the monster in its dullest costume, an operating budget. And the 2 last sisters, both past 80, stepped into public one more time, not for themselves, but for the house. Annette and Cecile lent their names and their voices to the campaign to save it, and the campaign worked. In November 2017, the city of North Bay voted to move the little house one more time, downtown, to the lakeshore, and in 2019, it reopened as the Dionne Quintuplets Home Museum. Think about what the 2 of them chose to fight for. At the end, out of everything the story might have owed them. Not a statue of themselves, not a wing of some archive, the farmhouse, the one building from before the Guardianship, before the gallery, before the Timetable, there had been only a small wooden house with no electricity. Inside it, a mother in trouble had been surrounded by women who fought for 5 impossible lives and won. That house held the only hours of their story that belonged entirely to their family. The sisters spent their last public strength making sure the country could not lose it. The house that had once been 100 steps from Quintland now sits by the lake in North Bay, open to anyone. Visitors stand today in the kitchen where the stove burned all night, and the room is smaller than anyone expects. It always was. The whole world once fit into that room, and the world never quite believed how little space a miracle needs. Every part of the machine is gone. The gallery, the stands, the parking lots, all of it. The story's smallest room outlived its biggest machine, and it turned out to be the only room the story ever needed. The year before the little house reopened, the country entered its own line in the ledger. In 2018, the Government of Canada designated the birth of the Dionne Quintuplets a national historic event. Be precise about what that is, because precision is this story's oldest debt. It is commemoration, not apology. Ontario had apologized, in a room, to living women 20 years earlier. The federal designation is a plaque, a marker of significance. The state's way of saying this mattered, remember it. And the words on such markers are chosen carefully. The event being honored is the birth, the lamplight morning, the midwives and the stove. It is not the machine that was built on top of them. The country chose to enshrine the one morning before everything went wrong. Perhaps that was tact. Perhaps it was the only piece of the story a nation could bear to put on a plaque. Either way, the designation completed a strange journey for that May morning of 1934. It had been a private emergency, then a world sensation, then an industry, then an indictment. Now it is heritage, official and permanent. The founding scene of a story the country has finally agreed to keep telling, with the sad parts left in. Plaques do not apologize. Plaques do not pay. But they do stand outside, in all weathers, longer than everyone who argued about the wording, and they do promise not to forget. And for a family whose ledgers were burned, being remembered accurately is not nothing. It is, in fact, most of what the sisters ever asked for. Cecile died on the 28th of July, 2025, at 91, after a long illness. The obituaries kept it simple, and so will this story. She was the one who had refused to sign, for 1 week, at 21, when refusal was a language none of them had been taught. She was the one who said, in 1984, that they had never been considered people. She had borne 5 children herself, and buried one in infancy, and lived long enough to be apologized to by a premier and to see the little house saved by the lake. 91 years, from the wicker basket to the 2020s, from a kitchen with no electricity to a world that carried her whole story in its pocket. When she went, one sister remained, Annette. For 5 months, one woman was the last living quintuplet, the final holder of a memory 5 had once shared, then 4, then 3, then 2. Every photograph in every album, every face in the museum cases, every voice in the old newsreels, she was now the only person alive who had been there. It is the loneliest arithmetic this story performs, and it performs it quietly, the way everything in these last years happened. 91 years earlier, nobody had believed any of the 5 would live past breakfast. Now the last of them carried 8 decades of goodbyes that no other living person could check against memory. No crowds now, no cameras posted at any fence, just an old woman in Quebec, in the autumn of 2025, holding the whole of it alone. On Christmas Eve 2025, Annette Dionne died in Quebec. She was 91 years old, the last of the 5, and the museum in North Bay made the announcement, the little house speaking for the family one final time. Between Cecile's death in July and Annette's on Christmas Eve, there was no fanfare left to have. The last of the 5 had outlived everything. She had outlived Quintland, its corridors long dismantled. She had outlived the big house and its silences. She had outlived the guardians, the doctor, the parents, the premiers, the syndicates, and every institution that had ever claimed a piece of her. She outlived them so thoroughly that her death arrived not as celebrity news, but as the closing of a history. 91 years and nearly 7 months from the lamplight kitchen to the quiet in Quebec. The story that began before dawn on the 28th of May 1934, in a farmhouse with no electricity, closed on the night the world hangs its brightest lights. That timing is framing, and this narrator owns it plainly. The facts are only these: a date, an age, an announcement from a small museum by a northern lake. But 91 years of this story have taught one lesson above all the others, that facts about these 5 were never only facts, and the last fact of all is this: the most watched childhood in the history of the world ended with one woman, unwatched, on the quietest holy night of the year. The museum's statement at Annette's death spoke, in its way, for a whole town, and the pages of these final years show what that voice had become. In their last public seasons, the 2 remaining sisters had lent their voices to saving the birth home. The museum, in turn, marked each passing as the family grew fewer. The institution and the sisters held each other up at the end. North Bay owed its depression survival, by Burton's old accounting, to 5 little girls, and when the last of them died, the town that had been built up around their childhood was the voice that told the world. There is a completed circle in that worth standing inside for a moment. The watching that began at a horseshoe corridor of one-way mesh has ended as remembrance in a small house by a lake. Visitors walk through the actual rooms, past the actual basket. Nobody is hidden from anybody. The glass is gone. What remains is closer to a vigil. The relationship between these 5 women and the crowds was the sickness of this story for 60 years, and in the end, in its smallest form, it became something almost like the love it had always claimed to be. A town keeping a family's house. A museum lowering its voice to say a daughter of the town has died. It took 91 years to get the watching right. It ended as keeping watch. So turn the lamp down the rest of the way. The kitchen is a museum now. The story is what it keeps, and all 5 of the girls the stove once warmed are gone, the last of them on a Christmas Eve. The story is over, and it is finally, entirely, theirs. Yvonne, Annette, Cecile, Emilie, Marie. The lamps are out in Corbeil. Sleep well, whoever is still awake out there. Good night.